Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. So this is an updated version of a presentation we've been giving for the past year. So when we first gave the presentation about a year ago, this stuff about GPT and ChatGPT and its use in educational settings was just hitting the news. And we originally had a longer sort of technical explanation. So now at the end of this year of the chatbot, we've sort of phase some of that out. You will have seen some of that in some of the other sessions. And we want to look a little bit more at sort of our experiences and reflections teaching this year on sort of what worked and what didn't. So this is just, to the extent that some of this seems kind of outdated and stuff that you'll already be aware of, it's because some of that will be from a year ago. OK, great. So here's our outline for what we're going to be talking about today. So just some of the introduction to large language modules, of which GPT is an example. So really brief overview, basically some photos of machine learning and artificial neural networks. And then to zoom in on some of the issues with large language models and their applications on student assignments, right? So the fact that ChatGPT, other sorts of systems like that, can be used by students to create their submissions for essays. So the central issues there, of course, are academic integrity and, in a deeper sense, the lack of learning that's going on when students use these systems to circumvent actually doing the work on these assignments themselves. And so we want to finish up today with some reflections and recommendations. So what worked and what didn't. And then just a suggestion, and specifically thinking about teaching writing, that this applies generally, but all the more for these kinds of assignments. And our advice is to focus on process and progress rather than on finished product. And we want to get some structural suggestions as to how you might do that. OK, so large language models. OK, so machine learning, that typically uses artificial neural networks trained on large bodies of data. That can be text or images. And specifically, large language models are trained on massive amounts of text, usually skimmed from the internet, other repositories, including Wikipedia, Reddit, as we heard earlier. And the magic of these, of course, is that they can produce coherent and novel text on demand. OK, so OpenAI's GPT is probably the large language model that most people are familiar with. So it's a generative AI. It creates new text. It's pre-trained in that it's already been familiarized with a large amount of data. And it's a transformer that just describes the kind of neural network setup that underlies it. So GPT 3.5, which is the last generation version, was trained on a data set of over 500 billion words from Wikipedia and the wider internet. It's an interesting list of what the repositories are. And what it consists in, the pre-training, where it lives, are in a set of 175 billion internal parameters. And so I'll say a bit more about exactly what those parameters are. But the whole thing fits into 800 gigabytes, right? So most current laptop hard drives can store the whole deal right now. So GPT, this technology of OpenAI's, is the LLM underlying ChatGPT, which many of you will have played with. I just want to add, this was also, large language models are also behind this news story you might have heard of last year with the Google engineer who was claiming that Lambda had come to life and deserved human rights and defense. And there's a whole conversation where it's talking about its wants and fears, right? And so this generates that kind of effect on people. It's so convincing in the way that it speaks. OK, so an artificial neural network is a really, really stripped down model of a neural network. So this is very old neuroanatomy diagram from Camillo Golgi, who you might know from the Golgi stain. So this is from the olfactory bulb of a dog in a dog's nose. And so this is a sort of hand-drawn schematic of that. So we go from something like that, where you see a bunch of neurons, their interconnections to each other, to the artificial case, which looks something like that. So we have it stripped down from that wealth of interconnections to a bunch of interconnected, basically, numbers, right? So each of those is going to have, the circles is going to have a sort of activation level, and that activation level it has is going to depend on, so at the input level, the way that your data is encoded that's going into the network, and then those 175 billion internal parameters are going to be the connection weights that are represented there by the arrows, right? So the degree of activation at one of those nodes in an earlier layer is going to be modified by the connection weight to something deeper in the network. And so those weights that's where the training lives, right? So any training that's happening is affecting the weighting on those arrows. Okay, so a neural network, so this early applications of these were often for visual problems, for vision science. And so here we have networks. So this is from an old Google, I think, technical website, showing how it distinguishes photos of cats and dogs. So at that bottom layer, the input layer, you have some kind of encoding of the photograph, right? And so that's going to be encoded as a kind of vector of a bunch of numbers. Those are going to activate things at the input layer. And those activations are going to typically, in this kind of thing, feed forward as modified by the connection weights that were generated during training. And so that feeds forward through the network, and you end up with a decision as to whether the photo's of a cat or of a dog. So with these LLMs, we have something a bit different, where given some input, so this is going to be the prompt string you enter into ChatGPT, you're going to get not a decision whether it's a cat or a dog, but as we were saying, what the most likely word, what the most highest pick for the next word is going to be, and you iterate that a couple times, and then you have your response. So it's a modification of this kind of setup. Okay, so Regina Rini at York University says this about ChatGPT. GPT-3, and so this you can again tell how old this is, GPT-3 is not a mind, but it's also not entirely a machine. It's something else, a statistically abstracted representation of the contents of millions of minds as expressed in their writing. Its prose spurts from an inductive funnel that takes in vast quantities of internet chatter, Reddit posts, Wikipedia articles, and news stories. When GPT-3 speaks, it is really only us speaking, a refracted parsing of the likeliest semantic paths trodden by human expression. So one thing that I found interesting, and I got into a discussion with this in a previous Q&A, was how quickly, so with this taking stuff from internet chatter, right? The kind of thing that people worry about is how whether in talking to it, it's adding to its knowledge base, right? So can it remember past conversations? The interesting thing about these is that where the training stage is entirely separate from the use stage, right? So none of that is actually going into the model, though there is a kind of band while you're interacting with it, where it's going to seem like it remembers things, right? So each iteration, so when we get these new numbers, that's when they've gone back and done some retraining. It's not sort of when you're talking to it. So it's not a kind of live intelligence. It's this, right? This refraction of a bunch of prose, and you need to go through the training process again to get any of that to really stick for future iterations. Okay, so this was the issue when we brought this forward about a year ago. LLMs are now easily accessible to the public, right? So OpenAI released ChatGPT. That's been in the news, and I think we've all had a chance to play with that quite a lot. So the OpenAI's API, the application programming interface, means that you can have access to, you can query the large language model for responses from almost any other app. And we're seeing examples of this now. It's getting built into the Microsoft Office suite. It's going to get built into search engines. You can have it on your phone, all kinds of applications, including star of the show, of course, ChatGPT. OK, so I'm going to turn things over to Alex now to talk about large language models and student assignments.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to take over from here. So let's talk a little bit about LLMs and student assignments, what we're all concerned about, right? First of all, I think it's important to think about why students are turning to resources like ChatGPT. These are performance anxiety. They want to do well on their assessments, right? Also procrastination, issues with the time management, as well as unfamiliarity with the process of writing. Students often report they're not sure how to begin. This being the case, how do we stop them, right? How do we stop them from turning to tools like ChatGPT? Well, Dave and I think that we should actually focus our efforts on addressing the root causes that drive students toward these tools, rather than focusing our energy on detection. Now, why is this? A couple of reasons. First of all, university policy actually discourages the use of LLM detection tools. So things like ChatGPT 0, right, which are meant to function such that we upload an essay and it tells us whether it was AI produced or not, right? So the university's stance is primarily due to the legal issues involved. Student work is copyrighted work. We can't just upload it to these servers, right? Because we don't know what they're doing with them. We don't know if they're retaining that, how they're going to use it, et cetera. Furthermore, there's also the unreliability of this detection software. It doesn't always deliver the correct result. And this means that in academic integrity hearings, a positive result from this kind of software doesn't actually serve as strong evidence that the student has actually committed an offense. This being the case, the student has to admit to having committed an offense in order for there to be any academic consequences. And of course, the prudent student will not do this, right? When it comes to detection, we've already talked about some of the reliability issues with current software. It's very easy for students to circumvent this software, right? So if you look at the image on the slide, we've got two example pieces of text. The first is produced by an AI. You can see it's very regular. And this is precisely because LLMs operate on a kind of predictive model, right? These are very average sentences, and they show up that way. On the other side, of course, we're contrasted with a piece of writing that was produced by a human. The prose is much more varied. Unfortunately, it's very simple to take something like this first piece of text and change it such that it looks more like the second, right? And suddenly, the detection software can no longer detect that this was an AI-produced piece of writing. The ChatGPT 0, the AI and AI catching software is it's something of an arms race, right? And it's just going to be the case that the AI is going to get better and better until it can't be detected by the software. This being the case, our recommendation is to not bother trying to detect whether a piece of writing has been AI produced or not. Instead of wasting our energy and resources on this increasingly difficult task, what we recommend instead is combating the root issues that drive students to use LLMs in the first place. As we said, performance anxiety, procrastination, unfamiliarity with the process of writing. What's critical is that these are not new problems, right? These are the same problems that students have been facing since before AI was even a concept. This being the case, we have some recommendations informed by our teaching practices this year. So Dave and I each taught a course. They were very different courses, but we had similar experiences in them, and we're going to share some of those with you now. So what worked this year in defeating ChatGPT? Well, in particular, specificity in assignments. Well-designed, intentional assignments that asked for things such as direct quotation or citation of the original source. Though we think it's not worth spending a lot of energy on the problem of detection, it's worth noting that LLMs like ChatGPT-4 aren't very good at direct quotation, at least for now. So this is one way that we can ensure that our students are doing their own work, is by asking for kind of proof of work, by pointing directly to the text where they have found the things that they're then reporting on in their writing. Similarly, we've found that tying take-home writing to in-class discussion has made a big difference. So rather than having students respond to an abstract question, asking them to respond to something that was discussed in lecture, brought up in tutorial, and reflect on that in particular. That's also been very successful. Similarly, in-class writing assignments involving either explanations of what was going on in class or explaining their own writing process, these kinds of things. What didn't work particularly well, interestingly, were frequent low-stakes writing assignments. So, among other things, I am lead writing TA for the Department of Philosophy. And one thing that we learn in our capacity as lead writing TAs is that frequent low-stakes writing assignments expose students to the process of writing and help alleviate writing anxiety, right? They're meant to combat the issue of performance anxiety that we discussed earlier. Perhaps surprisingly, this didn't turn out to be the case. Or if it did alleviate student anxiety, it only alleviated that around those frequent low-stakes writing activities and didn't actually translate to the more formal writing assessments. So while this is a good strategy for building engagement, especially in tutorials, we didn't find that it benefited student writing, especially on formal essays. We've also seen a number of alternative assignment formats. For instance, oral exams, having students produce infographics, videos, this kind of thing. These kinds of assignments have many pros going for them, but the big con is that unfortunately they solve the writing problem by removing the practice of writing altogether, right? And this issue is, of course, right, our students still aren't learning how to write, whether they use AI or we give them these new kinds of assessments. So, our big takeaway from the year of the chatbot is that we really need to go back to the basics. We should do the same things we were already doing to teach writing, only we should do them more intentionally, do them better. How do we do that? Well, we think it's important to think of understanding as not just like a snapshot, a final product, but rather as a kind of labor and ongoing effort. So Shannon Valor is a philosopher at the University of Edinburgh. She says, understanding is not an act, but a labor. Labor is entirely irrelevant to a computational model that has no history or trajectory. A tool that endlessly simulates meaning anew from a pool of data untethered to its previous efforts. And that's the AI, right? In contrast, understanding is a lifelong social labor. It's a sustained project that we carry out daily as we build, repair, and strengthen the ever-shifting bonds of sense that anchor us to the others, things, times, and places that constitute a world. So, if we view understanding as not merely input, output, here's the final product, evaluate it, but instead as an active ongoing labor, if we focus instead on what we're calling process and progress, and not just final product, we'll have much more success, right? We need to return to thinking about not just what students are writing, be it an essay, a lab report, etc., but rather how they're going about doing it. We also need to think about assessing student growth and development over time, rather than relying on just a single end product to tell us the full story of a student's learning and understanding. So, when it comes to process, we think it's important to teach and model the various stages of the writing process. That is, teach and show students how to take notes during a lecture, how to annotate a reading, how to take those two things and turn them into an outline, how to take an outline and turn it into a draft, how to revise a draft, these kinds of things. If we demonstrate and continually return to the process, then students won't have so much unfamiliarity or anxiety, right? Student progress can be evaluated effectively using revision exercises. So what you can do is have a slightly lower weighted assessment, that is, a first draft. You, as the instructor, or your TAs, or even the student's peers, can then make suggestive feedback on that draft. You then ask your student to revise the draft in light of the feedback, indicating on the new draft, via highlighting or something like this, where the changes have made. And then you can compare the two together to see clear demonstrations of student progress and growth. What we don't want to do is just look at the final essay or lab report or whatever it is, independent of the student's own growth and understanding, right? The final product is indiscernible from that produced by an AI. The progress that the student undergoes, however, totally different and much more valuable. So these are our thoughts so far. We're very happy to talk more about our individual courses, the tactics we employed, how they went, this kind of thing. And if you have any other questions or suggestions, we'd be very happy for them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very informative. So if you try to slightly flip the coin, so how about using ChatGPT to write a report based on computational results that you got, and after that, using it to describe what you got and interpret the results? Do you think there is a use of ChatGPT for those type of more creative purposes? It's still writing, but it's writing based on previous computations, let's say, in engineering.
Yeah, so we think that there's absolutely legitimate uses of ChatGPT as a learning tool. And in fact, we've talked about things like having ChatGPT produce an outline and having students try to write a paper based on that outline. This would allow them to practice not only the skill of the writing process, but also give them some insight into some of the shortcomings of ChatGPT and this kind of thing. So absolutely, I think that there is room for legitimate uses of ChatGPT. What you've described may very well be one of them.
And to follow up on that, I mean, from the keynote this morning, right, I think it's correct to assume that going forward, if it's possible to use it, there will be some students who use it, right? And so the purpose of the kind of assignments that we're thinking of, and in particular the revision exercise as sort of key to that, is to force students to go through some of the essential steps in the process, even if they're taking shortcuts with some of them, right? So at least one of the skills, you should be at least a good copy editor, in this age of the chatbot. You should be able to catch mistakes, right? Faulty citations, misspellings, if it's not saying what it should, if it's actually badly organized. That stuff is, I think, the kind of high-level sort of textual skills that a writing class is meant to teach. So if if you're starting from a kind of floor that's already there because of GPT, I think that's fair game, and in fact what we should expect over the next few years. There.
So this is great. I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on the process as the final product. But it does seem to require a lot more teaching resource, both on instructor and TA side. And also grading rubrics. Can you maybe talk a bit more about how you grade whether the student has done a good job of biasing it or not? So resourcing.
Yeah, so I had some experience with this in terms of trying to squeeze it in. So one thing, at least in the U of T context, it's absolutely true, it requires more teaching hours to allocate to it. For my course, I got a WIT designation, writing intensive
Teaching.
Yeah, writing integrated.
Integrated.
Writing integrated teaching, which any department can make use of on request, and that gets you extra money. So I was able to devote that to my TAs. So what did I do with those hours? The revision exercise was a lot of it. I tried out some of the in-class writing, which I think, the experience was actually really positive for some of the reasons in the previous talk, actually, in terms of engagement, retention, but it's not the same as the skills that go into teaching writing. So I think one of my takeaways is that I had to be more selective about what the essay would be on, right? I get one shot at this. It's going to take, I think it took altogether 6 weeks in a spring term course to run through the whole cycle of essay and revision. And so the last month of topics, that just ended up getting pushed to the final exam. There was no writing assignment on that. So, but I think what that does model is, there are different ways to approach the kind of knowledge you're trying to inculcate. You're not going to be able to get them to write an essay on everything if you're doing it, in this kind of more intensive way. Now, as far as rubrics go, I could be convinced of this. I'm totally willing to talk more about this. I just don't use them, right? I just think that, there's a kind of, I could make up some words, like there's a kind of multifactorial consideration of the things that go into that. But, the way that I put it to my TAs is, did they make full and sensible use of the comments they received from you? And then I also had peer reviews from other students. So those are all there. I required, my TAs to read all of this stuff, and then just to, rate. Did they make good use? Did they make excellent use? Poor, adequate? And those correspond to those things, right? So, it's hard to kind of mechanize that part as well, but I think that's what you'd expect and want. At the back there.
So I've been in creative writing, engineering design, and writing centers. Process over product is always in focus in all those areas.
Sure.
It's interesting to see humanities coming to this. I'm curious about what has that been like shifting the product focus in something like philosophy towards the process. And maybe this is related, I think very much related to just a question I was just kind of asked.
So I think so when I started my PhD, which was like, let's see, about a decade ago, let's say, that was already something that people were starting to do. The idea of revision exercises, their value, that is sort of the extent that we've gotten into it. I think that in a more granular way, though, right? There is some, I think, we haven't taken the time to write this down, but I think it would be good to have some documents surrounding this, the stages in that process, and having documentation for each of those bits in the process. How do you take notes? Here's a sheet, we'll do a mini class on that or some activity around that, right? And so that is, I think, the place where the revision exercise is kind of the classic example of that, but I think there's smaller exercises around note-taking, around outlining that you could design and throw in there, which I don't think would be that demanding. I mean, there'd be additional numbers of them, but you could make those pretty easy to grade.
So I really appreciate process as well. I have a design background also, but I'm going to play devil's advocate because I can definitely see my students and my kids saying to ChatGPT, okay, this is the original draft, this is the feedback I got, redraft another draft based on this. I just don't see process being enough to get around.
Yeah. So I think in order to combat this, we really do have to focus on specificity. I mean, ChatGPT is very good at revising and, in fact, role-playing. So if you tell it, imagine you're a student, and it's great at that. I think that just puts the onus even more on us to be very particular in our feedback, right? And not just say, revise this so that it's clearer, but to give a direction. That's tricky, of course, because then you feed the direction into ChatGPT. But something we're toying with now is starting or even entirely doing these kinds of writing instruction exercises in class. So giving students half an hour there with their laptops to respond to the feedback and have you there available to answer their questions as they encounter difficulties. That's what we're thinking about now. But you're absolutely right that this just continues to become more difficult.
Yeah, and to add on to that and to relate to the question from the man behind you, I mean, it's sort of, if that's the basement, right? If it's now possible to just require grammatical assignments from students, then yeah, the stuff we're going to have to be looking at is the kind of, are you delivering the information? Are you citing it properly? Is it the relevant bits? Are you making the kind of conceptual connections across that, the kind of organizational stuff? Because I think the baseline is going to be. This was something else that came up during the sort of first keynote today. I mean, what's the use for someone who can't even produce something that's up to the level of that? Why make students do that, right? But so I personally think it's still important to put students through the kind of unassisted writing stuff, because I think that's essential to developing a good copy editor's or a good line editor's taste, right, in what good writing looks like. But if it turns out that every student uses this to begin, I'm okay with that, so long as there's still some value add. There has to be a value add, and that would mean we increase our standards, sort of for like what we expected. If everyone's assignments are spelled correctly and have a broad overview in the background, then we need to repeat that. That's sort of what we're asking, which again is sort of, that's not new. That's what a good assignment always looked like. So yeah, that was always the ask.